Thank you, Thomas. Good morning, everybody. So, we have established the theme of the day is connection. Let's hope this clicker works. It does. Oh, there's more builds than I thought. Sorry, Adele, she's sneaking behind me. There's one more build. Yes, so the theme of the day is connection. So what Adele and I are going to do between us is connect two very different perspectives. From my good self, you're going to get the global perspective. And from Adele, you're going to get a much more detailed UK deep dive. So hopefully together we'll be greater than the sum of our parts. And we're going to give you some fantastic actionable insights to take away with you today. So to begin with, it's worth reminding us that everything we talk about, all of the wonderful insights are absolutely anchored in a lot of data. The Kantar BrandZ database has been filling up for the last quarter of a century, would you believe? And over the course of that time period, we have amassed more than 4.3 million consumer interviews on more than 21,000 unique brands. And one of the most important things we do with that data is we connect real-world, intangible brand equity with actual financial information through the brand valuations work that we do that Amy mentioned earlier on. And we'll be revealing this year's most valuable UK brands before we finish today's presentation. But from a global perspective, what have we learned this year by looking at those BrandZ brand valuations? And the first thing we've learned is that it is absolutely still possible to find growth using the power of brand. If we look at the performance of our BrandZ Global Top 100 in the last 12 months, their collective brand value has increased by a massive fifth, 20% overall. And not just that, I don't have it on the slide here, but what we've also seen is the role of brand. The contribution of brand to total company value is actually increasing as a proportion as well. And if we zoom out and look at where our global top 100 actually originate, they originate from markets all over the world. And every year we have new entrants to our global top 100, but also to our individual category rankings too. And if we look at those new entrants this year, you can see they come from an eclectic mix of markets. They come from an eclectic mix of categories too. So we're still seeing, despite the tumultuous global macroeconomic environment we're still living through, with the right level of investment, with the right strategy, of course, it is absolutely still possible to find and unlock growth through the power of brand. Adele, can you compete with that massive growth for the UK?
Sadly, Martin, I cannot.
No.
The results for the UK this year are in a bit of contrast to that. So the UK is heading in a slightly different trajectory to what Martin's just shown you from the global results. The total value of the UK top 75 brands this year has declined by 5% versus last year. But what to make of that? Well, it's actually quite good when you consider that last year we'd seen a 14% decline versus the year before. So that feels like it's kind of heading in a good direction. But if we compare it to some of the numbers on the right-hand side, maybe not so good. So compared to the global results, an increase of 20%, that feels a bit more modest. Compared to UK GDP growth, which is just in the positive at 0.1%, again, slightly modest against that. And over on the right-hand side, you've got now the top 30 comparison for the UK across all of the other local market rankings that we've published this year. And that change of -7 for the top 30 is the biggest decline of any of those local markets. So the big question for us this year was to dig into that data. What is going wrong? What is happening? And more importantly, what can marketers learn from it and do about it? And the more we looked at the data, the more this story of connection started to emerge. Whether that was connecting different data sets to get the full picture of what's happening with your brand, or connecting the long to the short, or working in a more connected way, connecting across the organization. And talking of connecting things, Martin.
Going to connect some things. Okay, it's time for everyone's favourite part of any corporate event or meeting. It's the organised fun bit. Who's ready for some organised fun? Oh, I thought nobody would be, so you've surprised me. Okay, good. We certainly are. So what we're going to do is play our own game of connection. So your job, as we keep talking, is obviously to listen to us. What we want you to do is think about what connects these four images. And we'll give you some clues along the way. There may have been a quite sizable clue already, which we were not expecting to have been shown yet. But anyway. So, who's ready for the images? Manchester United logo. Hooray. The Oasis band logo. Also hooray. A London black cab. King Charles himself. I should probably bow at this point. It's not King Charles specifically, he's there to represent the monarchy. So 4 things to think about as we talk. Manchester United logo, Oasis badge, black cab, King Charles. What is it that connects those 4 things? You may also notice that this may appear to be based visually on a popular UK game show that we're not allowed to mention for legal reasons, so I won't mention that. Something to do with connection. Anyway. Okay, so let's start with the first of our images, the Manchester United logo. Now, United are my team. And to be fair, my family are from Manchester, before you ask. And you may ask why they're my team. And good question, given the last few years, given recent results. But they are my team because of one word. Loyalty. I'm very loyal to this team. I would never support anybody else. I've chosen my team. I will stick with them for life. And loyalty is a big part of any decision to support a sports team. But not just football teams, any sports team. You make your decision. You stick with that team for life through thick and thin. I'm trying to find some other sports fans. It's difficult to see everybody, but my eyesight's pretty good. I can see Cy Atherley stood at the back there, one of Kantar's brightest and best. Cy, you're a football fan. Who's your team? Birmingham City. Oh, sorry to hear that, Cy. We sympathise. But that's an example of blind loyalty if ever I heard one. So maybe we should have a little round of applause for Cy's loyalty. Well done, Cy, for sticking with Birmingham City. You're probably wondering where we're going with this. So linking it back to brands, obviously, is the same true of brands? No, of course it's not. Increasingly, our industry is moving away from the notion of loyalty as something for marketers to aim for. It exists for vanishingly few brands. And thinking about an example, if I go into a store and I have a preference for Colgate toothpaste, which I do, if Colgate's not available, do I jump back in my car and drive across town to find it? No, of course I don't. I'm not loyal enough to the brand for that to happen. So if loyalty is not the goal, what is the goal? And those of you that have worked with Kantar before will know our answer. The goal is meaningful difference relative to your competitors. That's a key role of marketing, to imbue your brand with more meaningful difference than your direct competitors. And how do we know meaningful difference is so important? Well, we know partly from using the BrandZ database and BrandZ's valuations. We know that our global top 100 are particularly meaningfully different individually versus their individual competitors. But if we look at their progress over the last 12 months in terms of those brands in our global list that have improved their meaning and improved their difference, they are growing at a much faster growth rate than even other top 100 brands. So meaningful difference is powerful stuff. Is it in the UK, Adele?
Well, if we've got some signs that the UK brands have some areas of exposure and we know that being meaningfully different to more people is really important, then that kind of begs the question, how many of that top 75 group have become more meaningfully different to more people over the last few years? And the answer is not enough. Only a third of the UK's top 75 brands have increased their meaningful difference over the last few years. What, as Thomas mentioned earlier, what Warren Buffett might say, have widened their moat. And if you don't know the analogy from Warren Buffett, it is very nice. He's talked about it lots, but there's a nice quote here that we like. When our long-term competitive position improves, we describe this phenomenon as widening the moat. And doing that is essential if we are to have the kind of business we want a decade or two from now. A decade or two from now. So if the UK brands are not widening their moat sufficiently, then they are left more exposed to macroeconomic factors. They don't have that sort of insulation that helps businesses with very strong brands be more resilient. Now, here are some of the brands that have increased their meaningful difference over the last few years. And we're going to pull out one of these in particular, who has become meaningfully different to more people in not just one, but two different areas of their business. In August of 2023, from our brand dynamics data, we could see that M&S had a couple of different potential unlocks for future growth. So we're mapping here M&S in the food grocery category and M&S in the fashion category in the UK. And we're looking at how meaningful the brand is in those sectors and also how different the brand is in those sectors. So a year ago, in sort of summer of 2023, we could see that for food, they're incredibly different. And that's great, because as we'll go on to see, when you're very different, it's a lot easier to justify a premium price. The whole value proposition is different for consumers. But the big unlock for food is really about increasing the number of people for whom they think you're relevant to their needs, to stop you from hitting a sort of growth ceiling, which can happen to brands that are very different but not meaningful enough. Now, fashion had a slightly different challenge. So an absolutely familiar, well-known, well-loved fixture on the high street for sure, but the unlock potential for fashion is to try and inject a bit more of that zing, a bit more difference, a bit more standout, a bit more edge, because we know that's the kind of rocket fuel for future growth. Now, it would be tempting, perhaps, to tackle both of these things with one strategy, maybe a master brand strategy, and try and transcend what's happening in both of those sectors and lift it up to the master brand. But that's not what M&S did. They tackled the two challenges very differently. In food, there's a fantastic, I'm sure many people in this room on a Friday night have gone into M&S and chosen, for example, the dine-in deal for something that's akin to something as good as you'd get in your local gastropub, but more convenient and also a better price point as well. And that mission-based strategy has been a fantastic way of becoming more meaningful as well as different. They also relocated some stores, so it's easier to park and people can buy more in one visit and increase their range that's available through their partnership with Ocado. In fashion, this is a really tricky job. You're trying to rewire things that people have really believed for a long time about your brand, and that takes boldness and big ideas. And M&S brought brilliant catwalk trends into the store in a really accessible way and made some fantastic partnerships with brands like Adidas, Nobody's Child, Sweaty Betty, to really bring the edge and the differentiation back to the brand. And the results? Well, pretty phenomenal performance. You can see both of those brands in both of those sectors move into that top right-hand corner. So by August of this year, M&S Food had moved above the category average on meaningful difference in that sector. And in fashion, we've seen them close the gap on brand difference to John Lewis, which is a really incredible achievement. Now, this is not easy. And it takes connection across the whole organisation. It takes from communications to customer experience working together. And what M&S didn't do was try to do this by chasing loyalty. What they were able to do was find new people and give those people new reasons to consider them more meaningful and more different to the competition. So onwards, Martin, to our next connection clue.
Onwards. Okay, so if we've not had enough organised fun yet, we're now going to play a game within a game. So if you were paying attention earlier, who can tell me the connection between these two numbers? Any guesses? Relatively topical. There was a clue in our imagery earlier. There's a hand at the back. Yes, sir.
It's the price the ticket started at and where they ended up.
For what?
Oasis.
Correct. Yes. So these were the prices for Oasis standing tickets for their UK tour next year. £150 to begin with. Reasonably punchy, but by the time people were checking out, their dynamically priced Ticketmaster system were giving them prices of £355. Did anybody pay this much or anything for Oasis tickets? Anybody? Somebody did, somebody else did. I did with my friends. So I feel a bit better that other people also paid that much. But the point is a simple one, really. They sold 1.2 million tickets in a few hours, even at that price. So why was that? And really, there are parallels with brands here. It's because over a 30-year period, Oasis as a phenomenon, as a band, have created massive amounts of predisposition and demand, not just for their music, but for their tickets. And obviously, the band split 15 years ago. So for half of that time, the live supply had been turned off. So when it was turned on again, there was huge demand because of that pent-up predisposition as it was unleashed. And that also meant, there was a bit of FOMO, of course, but it also meant people were so desperate for those tickets, they were still able and still willing to pay such a high price for those tickets. So predisposition basically equates to two things, demand and high pricing. And if we use our global database again, we see that borne out. In our global top 100, we see those brands with the highest predisposition are much better able to generate demand as a result of that predisposition, and they are much better placed to charge a price premium versus their competitors because of that predisposition. So it is possible to drive both volume and value using the power of brand. Adele, what's the story Morning Glory? Wait for my joke. What's the story Morning Glory from a UK perspective?
Very good, Martin. Now, we know that price is a really pertinent issue because it is now, there's huge amounts of evidence now showing that price is really the biggest driver of profitability, not just sales growth, not just cost cutting. And in the UK, if we look particularly at the brands in the top 75 set that are trying to justify a price that's higher than category average, not enough of them are able to do it. Now, how do we know that? Well, we can create a score for each brand that we call pricing power, which is a prediction of what a brand can charge relative to category average based on how meaningful, different and salient the brand is to consumers. And then we can compare that prediction of that price to the price that the brand is actually charging in market. And we have a pretty good relationship, but we also have outliers. And in outliers, we find opportunities and risks. So here you've got, within the top 75, all the brands that are trying to charge a higher than category average price and how their pricing power compares. Now, the brands at the top are in the overperforming box. That means for some of these, actually, their pricing power actually exceeds the price that they're trying to charge in market, which is a fantastic thing to do and opens up all sorts of interesting opportunities about how you can manage your price promotion strategy. But it's quite interesting to compare the top overperformers and this almost 40% who are at risk of being overpriced, meaning their pricing power in people's heads does not justify the price they're trying to charge or is at risk of not justifying that. So let's have a look at these two groups in a bit more detail. Now, of course, the ones at the top, they do have a higher pricing power score than the ones at the bottom, fine, but it doesn't stop there. The ones at the top are also less elastic. So we've got really good evidence now across several categories that there's a really good relationship between a brand's pricing power and how elastic their prices are. So in other words, the brands in that top group, if they increase their prices, they'll have less of a negative impact on their volume sales than the brands in the bottom group. And the brands in the bottom group can start to find themselves in a bit of a tricky situation because they can maybe be managing things around the edges a little bit, a bit of a sticking plaster here or there, and perhaps realise a bit too late that they're managing promotions to uphold sales and then finding themselves affecting margins and profits quite considerably. So what is the cure? How can brands improve their pricing power and their price inelasticity? Well, you can see the difference between these two groups on that perceived relative difference. What consumers think. Do they think they stand out? Do they offer something different to the rest of the competitors? And you can see the average score between those two groups, 131 for the brands at the top and 96 for the brands at the bottom. Now, this is a really powerful thing. It's a sort of example of what Martin was talking about with the Oasis tickets. We know that people will pay more for something that they feel is somehow different on things that matter to them. Why is that? Because it introduces a sort of bit of jeopardy in the choice. Put another way, your sales and profits are at risk if people think there's nothing to lose by choosing an alternative brand. So the Oasis example is an extreme one, but it's something that you might want to think about in terms of just creating an edge of jeopardy in the choice of choosing an alternative versus your brand. Now, it's quite difficult to improve your difference. It doesn't move particularly quickly, and it takes quite a lot of big gestures to be able to do it. But we have an example of a brand this year that has had a phenomenal performance on this front, so I just want to show you that. Nationwide has long been celebrated and very well known as a mutual within the sector, and even at the beginning of this data here is from January 2023 in BrandZ, they were scoring the highest of all of the brands in that financial services set on all the things there you can see on the left-hand side. But the sector had been disrupted quite considerably by lots of new emerging banks that were really changing how people expected their services to look in that sector, and that had an impact on Nationwide. Historically, they'd been very above the average on difference, but you can see at the beginning of 2023 they were trailing that category average of 100. But look what's happened in the last 18 months. Now, this is data from our Brand Dynamics data set here. This is a daily data subscription service, daily data that's statistically robust, and that means you cannot get more reliable, sensitive data to look at what's happening as a result of your marketing activity. And you can see the clear movements in brand difference for Nationwide in line with three particular things. So we have the profit share initiative, which you can see made a big difference here. So actually giving a cash payment out to their members, but also the rebrand and the ad launch of the new campaign with Dominic West. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, all right, but I can't give a huge chunk of profits away to my customers. Yes, that's not the point. The point here is what Nationwide have done particularly well is they have connected the exposures people have to their brand through their comms campaign with tangible experiences that they have with their brand. And that creates this compound effect that you can see here. I should say we looked at the daily data for Nationwide this morning, who their new ad came out on air yesterday. We can see the ad awareness going up in yesterday's data. So if you want to come and see that, you can come and talk to us in the Ignition Zone and we'll show you the data up to yesterday. And in the wider sector, we've got really good results for Nationwide as well. So amongst their customers, those customers, they do really feel that Nationwide's experiences make that brand seem more different to them. And they're half as likely to churn and twice as likely to recommend. And in the wider sector, Nationwide is 13 times higher than its next best competitor on current account switching results. So difference is difficult to move, but not impossible. It's about your exposures and your experiences working together to predispose people to either create that demand or that willingness to pay more. Martin, tell us about our next clue.
Ooh, taxi figure area. How many of us got a London black cab here today? Nobody. Nobody did. Okay, well, that's interesting. That plays into my hands, as you will see. And it's very frustrating when you attempt and you've planned to go and flag a cab on the street and it's not there at the moment of need. And there is an obvious parallel there with brands as well, because all brands, to some extent, exist to meet a particular need or maybe a set of needs. But if your brand is not present at the moment that the consumer or the customer is making that choice, you are potentially leaving a huge amount of money on the table. It doesn't matter if you've been very successful in building up the critical predisposition we've talked about. If your brand is not there, either literally or metaphorically, when that decision is made, if you're not present, you are leaving a massive opportunity on the table and waiting to be fulfilled. And again, if we look at our global data set, we see that borne out by the world's most valuable brands. The most valuable brands are less dependent on activation, and they are much better at converting brand equity into sales. Do we see the same from a UK perspective, Adele?
Well, in the UK, Martin, we're seeing far too many sales left on the table unconverted. Here you're looking at the top 75 brands, but the value of the bar here is the percentage of each brand's demand power not converted into sales. So demand power is a prediction of a brand's market share based on how meaningful, different and salient people find the brand. And we can compare that to the market share the brand actually has. And we can see whether there's a mismatch of the type Martin was just talking about. And in the top 75 brands, the top third here, on average, are leaving just under half of their predisposition unconverted. And as Martin said, this is worth real money. We've got one brand in our top 75 leaving 1.8 billion on the table. So they've done all the hard work. This is a car brand. Done all the hard work creating the demand, wanting people to, getting people predisposed to buy, but then for some reason, something else is happening between that point and actually choosing this brand, and the sale instead is going somewhere else. Now, the reason for that is very dependent on your sector, as I'm sure you can imagine. So in cars, it could be connected to how many dealerships you have, or what the car is actually like when you test drive it, or maybe the appeal of the different finance options that you've got. But if you're in an FMCG sector, it could be much more about the range, the format, your distribution channels, your visibility on the digital or the physical shelf. And if you're in online retail, it could be connected to things like website loading times or the payment options that you have. The point is, this is about how easy it is to buy your brand. And if you can crack this, you can unlock a lot more sales into your balance sheet, like this brand, everybody's favourite, Greggs. Oh, we've got a groan. No, come on, we love it. Now, Greggs has done all sorts of absolutely brilliantly newsworthy stuff recently, from the amazing merchandise tie-ups. If any of you bought your Greggs jewellery, I hope you're wearing it today, to having, sausage roll dispensing cash machines a couple of months ago in Newcastle. But they've also been spending a lot of time and effort doing something a bit less newsworthy, but just as important, making Greggs easier to buy. They've opened 145 new stores, and if you can't be bothered to walk to a store, you can get in your car and go to a drive-through. But if you can't be bothered to leave your house, Just Eat can bring you Greggs straight to your door. They've also extended their opening hours, and yesterday, as I was travelling through London Bridge at about 6 o'clock, there was an enormous queue outside Greggs with people waiting to buy something that, let's face it, they're going to eat on the train home and then get to their house and have an entire dinner as well when they get back. They're taking the opportunity to absolutely jump on the new snacking occasion of the commute home. So Greggs has done an amazing job of unlocking. You can see here, this is the difference between their unconverted demand from a few years ago to more recently. That's reduced by a quarter, and their household penetration is up by a third. This is often a sort of under-celebrated lever of brand growth, and it really shouldn't be, because as Martin said, you can have all the predisposition in the world, but if you're too difficult to buy, you won't make the sale. You must be more present where decisions in your category are being made. Martin, tell us about our final clue.
Did you join the Greggs queue though, Adele?
I'm saying nothing.
So yes. I'm still reeling from the fact that nobody got a black cap here today, to be honest. Okay, our final image is of King Charles himself representing the UK monarchy. And the king and the monarchy have a problem, as we know. Just because Mummy was popular doesn't necessarily mean that you will be. And it's a good job he's not here today. I'm sorry, King Charles. But there is a parallel between the royal brand and all brands generally, because all brands, including the royal family, are beholden to ensure they are constantly modernising. They are constantly reinvigorating their brand as attitudes and behaviours and the market generally changes. And if they're not able to do that successfully, then relevance will suffer as a result, and the brand will eventually decline and potentially fall. Hopefully that's not the case with the monarchy, but time will tell. And of course, one way that brands in particular, and the royal family to an extent, need to modernise and reinvigorate is by finding a new generation, by finding a new audience. That could be younger consumers coming to the category for the first time as older consumers move away, or it could be actually reaching outside of that category to find growth somewhere else that the brand's ideals are applicable to. Adele.
Well, as you say, Martin, the size of a brand today is actually a terrible predictor of its chances of growth tomorrow. But do you know what is a good predictor of the chances of its growth tomorrow? How meaningful, different and salient it is to consumers. And so we use those scores to predict the percentage chance that a brand will grow in the next 12 months. And we call that a brand's future power. And when we look at the top 75, too many of that group are leaving their future growth chances in the balance. So just under a third have less than 45% chance of growth in the next 12 months based on how people feel about the brand. Now, here are some of the ones that are in that top group with, they've sort of created almost a kind of tailwind for themselves. And that's because, I mean, they're all pretty big brands, right? But their meaningful difference scores are not just high, they're higher than you'd expect, even for a big brand. And that's a proven predictor of a future potential sales growth. But when you're already big, one question is, how likely are you to grow? The next is, where can you grow into? What can you do? And so you have to really intentionally find new space that you can grow into. And this particular brand, the one that we've pulled out from that group, Premier Inn, has done exactly that. So what we're looking at here is current category penetration versus that future power score. And where you sit on this means you've got very different jobs to do about how you're going to go about finding new space to grow into. And for brands in the situation that Premier Inn is there, often it involves asking some pretty big questions, sometimes about what business you're actually in to be able to find the adjacencies to grow. And what we love about what Premier Inn has achieved in the last few years is that they've taken this on in a very wide variety of ways. They've been targeting new audiences with business travel. They've been premiumizing through introducing their Premier Plus range of rooms, which means not just more people making bookings, but spending more per trip. They've been adapting to emerging needs, so their city centre locations now are more kind of urban hubs than hotel. They've been playing with some of their reception spaces, trying to make them a bit more sort of Starbucksy third space, where you might take a work call or you can socialise and not feel confined to your room. And this sounds like a really simple one in a way, but it still really matters. They've launched into a new market, a very successful launch into Germany, which is continuing with more locations being built as well. And they've done that while really retaining that very Premier Inn tone of voice, which is really about fun, inclusivity and positivity, which we really love, because while you're evolving, you've also got to stay the same at the same time. So the lesson here is, don't be complacent about your future growth. You must find new space to grow into. Martin, please reveal our connection.
Okay, so these are our 4 images. Those are our 4 insights. Perhaps if I add a couple of builds, it might help. Effective brand building. Any guesses from the audience as to what the connection might be? I wonder if Amy Cashman might have a guess. Anybody who was listening, what's the connection? Blueprint, hooray. Thank you down there. Adele.
Yeah, so in very, very poor disguise.
I think that's right.
This was the growth driver and our growth accelerators of our blueprint that Amy showed to you earlier. And it was looking at the UK 75 results this year through the lens of this growth driver and growth accelerators that revealed the areas of exposure for UK brands. Because as you've just seen, not enough of them are becoming meaningfully different to more people. Too few can justify their price, too many are leaving sales unconverted on the table, and too many with future growth left in the balance. Now that all sounds a little bit doom and gloom, doesn't it? I don't mean it to, because you've also seen some fantastic examples of brands that are thriving this morning. And you may also have noticed they're not all from the same sector. They're not all small disruptor brands. They're not all really big brands. Success can come from anywhere. But how? Well, it does come back to connection. Marketing has the potential to be the engine of businesses, and we'll hear in a second about the role of brand in the boardroom and how that's increasing. But brands aren't magically commercial assets. And your destiny, as we've seen from the top 75, is not fated. So ask yourself, are you able to connect brand and behaviour to get the full picture of what's happening with your brand? Do you know that the strength of the brand in people's heads matches the price you're trying to charge? Are you getting the volume share you deserve based on the predisposition you have? Are you able to connect the long to the short? Do you really have short-term indicators of long-term outcomes, not clicks and conversions, but what's happening in people's heads to your brand? And are you connecting across the business? Are you connected to your CX team, your finance department, your board? If you're answering no to any of those questions, come and talk to Martin and I in the Ignition Zone later. And if you do one thing when you get back to your desk differently, please make connected intelligence your goal. But BrandZ is really about celebrating brands. That's what this whole initiative is all about. So we close by doing just that. We're going to finish now in all its glory with revealing the top 75 most valuable UK brands for 2024. Congratulations to them all.